Hey guys, welcome to Module 7. This is going to be my quick overview of project number 2. Um, and the focus this week is really going to be on the components of the United States criminal justice system. So we're going to be looking at law enforcement, courts, and corrections. So one of the first things we're going to be looking at is the law enforcement functions, and that's going to be found, a lot of the information that you probably need can be found in Chapter 5. And so what are the different law enforcement agencies at different levels? So remember, we have law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. So an example of federal law enforcement would be like the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We also have DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, or ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm. Okay, so that's going to be at the federal level, and obviously their jurisdiction is nationally. Then we'll have state. Now, states are a little bit different because typically you might have state police or highway patrol. The distinction between state police and highway patrol is highway patrol typically has their sole function of highway enforcement, traffic regulations, typically on state highways, interstate highways, and unincorporated areas in which there are no police departments. State police, depending on where you're from, may be involved in criminal investigations as well as the traffic enforcement function. All right, so their jurisdiction is throughout the state. So, the California Highway Patrol has jurisdiction throughout the state of California on enforcing state traffic laws. Then we have local, and this is primarily going to consist of your county sheriff and your municipal police departments. All right, so these are the basic different law enforcement agencies at the different levels. What's key to note here again is their jurisdiction, their ability to enforce the law. Typically, local law enforcement is only going to be enforcing the law locally within the municipality in which they work or the county in which they work. They're not going to go out of the area to investigate crimes somewhere else in the state. Whereas state police, for example, may come in and do a criminal investigation in different parts of the state, depending on what's going on. You're seeing some of that now in Georgia, for example, following the recent officer-involved shooting. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, has been asked to come in, and sometimes that ensures some level of impartiality because GBI is a state police function, so they're not necessarily tied to that specific community. All right, so the idea being that they could be maybe more objective in their ability to investigate certain type of offenses. Okay, so what are the jurisdictions of different levels of law enforcement for various types of agencies? Well, federal law enforcement agencies have jurisdiction only if there's been a violation of federal law, or could be federal constitution if it's tied to a federal law, maybe like a civil rights violation or something to that effect. But typically it has to be a violation of federal law, such as United States Code Title 18, Section 2113. That's the federal statute for bank robbery. All right. Now, state and local have jurisdiction over cases that are a violation of state laws, like state burglary or robbery statutes. Okay. Local law enforcement and local authorities also have the ability to investigate violations of county or municipal code. All right, so those might be violations such as reckless driving on private property, something to that effect. So it's all going to be about jurisdiction. All right, again, federal law enforcement, the jurisdiction has to be a violation of federal law, but then they can investigate things throughout the United States. State and local typically are going to be enforcing state and local laws, and that's going to be the extent of their jurisdiction. All right, you're not going to have state and local law enforcement agencies going out of state to investigate some other criminal activity. They don't have jurisdiction. Typically, even your municipal law enforcement agencies are going to be somewhat confined to their own municipality to enforcing the laws and so forth. In other words, I can't go to a neighboring city and decide I'm going to enforce their municipal code. That I don't have jurisdiction. Okay, so that just the purpose here is just so you understand the understanding and importance of jurisdictions at the different levels. All right, and you'll find more information in our textbook. How do law enforcement officers apply discretion? And you can find a lot of this information in Chapter 6. Discretion is the authority to make a decision between two or more options. So, for example, to arrest a juvenile or release to his parents. That would be the use of discretion. Now, sometimes discretion is limited, and oftentimes it's going to be limited by law, either state law or your department policies may limit your discretion. And so a lot of times we tend to limit police discretions on areas of public policy, for example, domestic violence. Typically, domestic violence, as it has evolved over the decades, pretty much now when there's a case of domestic violence, one or both parties are going to go to jail. If there's evidence to show that one was the aggressor and to support the claim that of domestic violence, all right? So we sort of taken discretion away from police officers there. Use of force, there's generally going to be strict policies on that, police pursuits, and even missing juveniles. Typically, if a juvenile is under a specific age, then law enforcement cannot ignore this. They have to be doing certain things in order to take active steps to locate the minor. So that's the issue about discretion. The other thing is that there's a quote from our textbook, is the police are among the most important policymakers of our entire society, and they make far more discretionary determinations in individual cases than does any other administrator. So the argument has often been whether or not police should have discretion or not have discretion. I think discretion is an important tool that police officers need. There's no way that the courts can handle the amount and volume of citations or criminal cases if police didn't exercise some level of discretion. All right, so the question becomes, how do we ensure that police are using discretion appropriately within the organization so that we don't have issues pop up with there's some people are applying this method and some aren't, for example. So discretion can sometimes be a slippery slope, but that's discussed in your textbook on Chapter 6. But again, it's important to understand what discretion is and how it applies to law enforcement, right? Now I'm going to talk a bit about the court system. Just as with law enforcement, there are different levels within our courts. All right, so we have in the United States the idea of a dual court system, federal and state courts. And with state courts, we're going to include local courts, but they are part of the state function. So we have a dual court system, federal, state. So we have the federal courts, and we already researched that. The trial courts within the federal system are known as the federal trial courts, or the United States district courts, all right? And federal courts are broken up into United States districts. And so we talked about that before. You've seen the video on it early on. But Chapter 9 has that, again, goes over that information. But federal courts, again, have jurisdiction, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that's the federal trial court, is the United States District Court. We also talk about the appellate court, the United States Circuit Courts of Appeals, and then the United States Supreme Court, which is the law of the land. The state, we have trial courts of what we call trial courts of general jurisdiction. These are trial courts that tend to hear the more serious cases, such as homicides, civil suits, typically in excess of $5,000, depending on where you live. Most felony cases, family law matters, are handled at the trial courts of general jurisdiction. Local courts can be trial courts of limited jurisdiction. These are often associated with justice of the peace type courts, where you're going to hear cases involving minor traffic violations, maybe some local housing violations, or typically those type of things. Local courts are going to be limited in their jurisdiction. In other words, the type of cases they can hear. Oftentimes, local courts may be limited in the dollar amount of civil cases that they can hear. Typically going to be under $5,000. In some cases, it might be less. All right, so these are the three different structures, although, again, we have a dual court system, and state and local has been sort of lumped together. All right. What are the jurisdictions of the different court systems? So, again, federal courts have jurisdiction to hear violations of federal law, such as the bank robbery example I gave you, or U.S. Constitution or Bill of Rights violations, so Fourth Amendment violations, free speech violations. Those type of things can be heard in federal court. So if you believe, for example, that your rights as a United States citizen have been violated via free speech, for example, you have the right to sue somebody in federal court for violating your constitutional rights. So federal courts, again, are limited by federal laws and then U.S. Constitution, right? State courts, again, more general jurisdiction, violation of state and local law and state constitutions, such as burglary, robbery, drug offenses. So those are the type of jurisdictions you're going to see here. You're not going to find a violation of federal law is not going to be tried in state court because you can't do that. Now, sometimes these two may have joint jurisdiction. In other words, bank robbery, for example. Although bank robbery is also a federal crime, it's also a state crime because it falls under the general robbery statute, all right? But I'm not going to confuse it there. But just understand that the key difference in the court system is jurisdiction. In other words, the type of cases that they are allowed to hear is what guides their jurisdiction. And for federal courts, it has to be a violation of federal law or U.S. Constitution. State courts, it has to be a violation of state law or state constitutions. How might a case progress to the courts? So again, see page 236 to 248 in our textbook. Basic steps are, and I'll just outline them here, is you have a crime and an arrest, you have an initial appearance in court, then you may have a preliminary hearing or grand jury, depending on how your state is structured. Then after that, the DA will either file an information if you do the preliminary hearing or an indictment if used the grand jury system. After that, you'll be arraigned on those charges. Then you'll have a trial. Part of that trial process, which can be somewhat lengthy, and I'm saying that trial process means there's a lot goes on between arraignment and trial and even through the trial. So you may have things like plea bargaining come up, areas and ways in which a case would be disposed out. Sentencing, finding after the guilty verdict, you're going to have some sentencing and then always potential for appeals. You can look at your textbook. I think the very last page of your textbook should have a diagram of the basic steps involved in the criminal court system. So take a look at that. If you need any help with that, let me know. Otherwise, pages 236 to 248 highlight the key steps. So that would be a good source for you to use. Correctional system, explain how correction systems functions. They ask you to look at the idea of public versus private. So you're going to have to be focusing on chapter 12 to get a good understanding of how correction systems function. And so you're going to be looking at roughly pages 303 to 314. They ask you to look at public versus private, and you can check pages 318 to 320. Private prisons are a way that some states try to reduce costs. Typically in private prisons, you're going to have your nonviolent offenders. If you have violent offenders, they're going to go to state prison or public, right? This is typically going to be, private prisons are typically going to be found at the state level or the federal level. You're not going to have too many private prisons at the local level because counties have jails, and so the county oversees county jails, okay? So you're going to have more private prisons or institutions at the state and federal level and not so much at the county or local level. In terms of jurisdictional issues, again, we have local, state, and federal. So at the local level, we have county jails. And county jails are where people wait if they haven't made bail to appear in court for cases, or if somebody has been found guilty and has been sentenced to typically 1 year in the county jail, 6 months or in the county jail. So basically 1 year or less in the county jail. That's what's held at the county jail. It is a hodgepodge because you have all type of offenders. You have people awaiting trial. You have people who have been convicted awaiting sentencing. You have people who have been sentenced for misdemeanor or infraction type offenses serving time in county jail, okay? State prisons are for the more serious offenders. Typically here you're looking at people that have been convicted of a serious felony crime. Assault, rape, significant drug trafficking offenses. Again, jurisdiction here is it has to be a state crime. So if you've been convicted of a state crime,